Luke Carter had always been stubborn. It wasn't a bad thing, exactly. Just the kind of stubbornness that made neighbors shake their heads and mutter about hard-headed farm boys or folks who think they know better than winter itself. And right now, that stubbornness had him crouched in the late afternoon sun, dragging a pile of rough-cut logs from the shed toward the narrow front yard of his aging farmhouse in western Kansas. The wind had already started to stir, teasing the tall grass with icy fingers. Winter was early this year, sharp and insistent, the kind that snuck through doors and windows no matter how tightly you sealed them. Luke's house, built by his grandfather in the 1940s, had character, history, and a draft that seemed to mock anyone who tried to stay warm. He had tried blankets, layers of insulation, old windows he patched with plastic, and even that ridiculous foam they sold at the hardware store. Nothing worked. Heat vanished as if it had never existed, and the furnace grumbled like it was giving up. He squared his shoulders and began stacking the first logs, rough and uneven, into what looked like a crude wall just a few feet from the porch. Each piece thudded onto the ground or leaned against the next with a sound that echoed in the hollow, frost-stiffened air. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't about anyone but him. He remembered his grandfather's words, spoken slowly over the smell of sawdust and whiskey years ago. "Stone and timber, boy. Stack 'em right and the wind can't eat your fire." Luke had been 12 at the time, half listening, more interested in the way the wind made the field dance. Now he understood. He had learned the truth the hard way over decades of winters spent shivering, watching bills climb and his patience dwindle. "Luke, what in the world are you doing now?" He looked up to see Benny Thompson, his neighbor across the road, standing in the driveway of his own house. Coffee steaming in a chipped mug, heavy coat buttoned to his chin, eyebrows raised like twin snowdrifts. Two more neighbors had appeared behind him, drawn out by the commotion. "I'm keeping warm," Luke said, straightening. Benny snorted. "That pile of wood, you planning to build a fort for squirrels?" "Something like that," Luke said, trying not to smile. "I'm building walls." "Walls," a woman called from the edge of her porch, her voice carrying on the wind like it had practiced this laugh for years. "Looks more like a leaning mess." Luke didn't argue. He went back to stacking log after log, rough edges biting into his gloves. He measured each with the eye he had honed over years of fixing barns, repairing fences, knowing the way gravity would press and settle. Two parallel walls he planned, wide enough to form a gap between them, a trench of shelter against the wind. Then stones, lots of stones. He had scavenged a pile from the creek behind his property, smooth and heavy, some the size of a loaf of bread, others small enough to fit neatly into the wall's belly. By dusk, the walls had risen 4 feet, a crude corridor for the wind to hit and bounce off, while Luke knelt in the gap, fitting stones into the narrow tunnel like a mason possessed. The neighbors lingered, shivering, curiosity overtaking ridicule, though no one approached. "Luke, you're insane," Benny said finally, kicking a loose stone. "That wind'll just laugh at you." Luke looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "Let it try." Inside, the house groaned as if warning him it wasn't sure this experiment would succeed. Luke brushed snow from his boots and checked the door. The gap was tight, the walls straight, or as straight as weathered logs would allow. He could already feel the air shifting slightly, not rushing straight in like it used to. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was a start. The first night came fast, the kind of cold that bites at ears and nose, creeping through every seam and crack. Luke lit the stove and sat, arms crossed, listening. The wind screamed across the plains, lifting corn stalks that had long since been harvested and rattling the loose siding like a warning. He imagined his grandfather watching from some distant corner, nodding slowly, a hint of pride hidden under a scowl. By morning, Luke's experiment had drawn a small audience. Cars slowed on the county road, muffled conversations drifting over snow-slick pavement. People whispered, pointed, and yes, they laughed. Two walls of logs with stones jammed between them seemed to them little more than eccentricity, folly, and a dangerous flirtation with disaster. Then the wind came. Not a whisper, not a teasing finger of cold. This was a bite, a slap, a sharp insistence that winter had arrived to claim dominion. Luke watched from the doorway as it hit the log walls. The first strike split the air, gusting through the empty spaces of the yard, But then, almost imperceptibly, the wind bent. It couldn't force its way straight through. Gap, the stones shifted slightly but held their ground. The air inside the corridor was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that meant victory in its tiniest form. Benny leaned against his truck, mouth open. Holy hell. Martha Keene, who lived 3 doors down, stepped closer. Her scarf flapped in the breeze as she studied the structure. You're telling me this is supposed to keep the house warm? Luke nodded slowly. It'll hold the heat. It's not magic, just physics and patience. You mean it works? Benny asked, incredulous. Luke shrugged. It will if it doesn't fall apart. That evening he stoked the stove higher than usual, watching the temperature climb. For the first time in years, the kitchen didn't feel like an icebox. He pressed his hand against the cold wall by the door. It was still there, of course, but the sting was gone. A gentle warmth lingered in the air, trapped and held in by the crude ingenuity outside. By midweek, curiosity became fascination. Neighbors came over to peek at the walls, many still skeptical, but some intrigued. Luke showed them the stones, how to wedge them, the importance of the gap and the angle of the logs. He demonstrated patience, careful measurements, and why he had built 2 walls instead of 1. You've got to respect the wind, he told them, voice low but firm. It's not just cold air, it's force, it's persistence. It'll find weakness if you give it one. Martha, older and weathered, nodded. I think you just told us how to fight an enemy we've always accepted. Luke smiled faintly, or at least how to make it wait its turn. And still he worked, stacking, adjusting, pressing stones into gaps, testing angles against the gusts. He didn't stop when the neighbors left. He didn't pause when the sun dropped behind distant ridges. He kept at it because he knew the truth. Warmth wasn't a given. It was earned, and right now, every stone, every log was a small victory against winter's relentless claim. As darkness fell, the wind howled like a beast, snapping at the walls, but for the first time, Luke felt a quiet triumph. The house was holding heat, the stone-filled gap slowing the draft, and somewhere deep in the evening's cold, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: control. He leaned against the doorframe, listening to the storm outside. Neighbors, laughter had turned into whispers of awe, even cautious respect. They didn't understand everything he was doing, not yet, but they were watching. They would remember. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stove's warmth wash over him, feeling the stubborn, quiet heat trapped between 2 walls and a row of stones. Tomorrow he would test it further. Tomorrow he would refine it. And if the wind thought it could win, well, tomorrow it would learn. Tonight, though, he allowed himself a small, private victory. The logs were crooked, the stones uneven, but the heat stayed where it belonged. The wind might have the plains, the fields, the corners of the world, but not this home. Not tonight. And in the quiet, Luke Carter finally felt, for the first time that winter, like he was on the winning side. The next morning, Luke woke to a world transformed. The wind had dropped to a sharp, steady whistle, threading through the skeletal trees like a skeletal finger. Frost laced every surface, glittering in the pale sun like a million shards of glass. His breath clouded in the kitchen as he poured coffee, hands wrapped around the mug like it might warm more than just his skin. He didn't rush outside, though part of him wanted to. He had learned that winter had its own patience, and any display of eagerness would be punished with gusts and numbing cold. Instead, he watched from the window as the shadows of his log walls stretched long across the yard. The stones nestled between them caught the weak sunlight, glowing like coals held captive, and he felt a quiet swell of satisfaction. That's when the first knock came. A sharp, brisk rap against the front door. Luke opened it to find Martha Keene standing there, cheeks pink from the cold, scarf wrapped tight around her face, a thermos cradled in her gloved hands. "You've got something going here," she said, voice muffled by wool. "I've never felt the house this warm." Luke nodded, shrugging. 2 walls, stones in the middle, it's holding. She stepped onto the porch, peering into the stone-filled gap. "Looks like a lot of work." "It is," he said, "but worth it. You feel that draft in here?" He gestured to the kitchen. "It's still there, but it's softer now, gentle, not a slap in the ribs." Martha smiled faintly. "I think people are going to want you to teach them this." Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could feel it. the way the wind curled around the log walls, tugging at the loose edges but never penetrating fully. This was a kind of victory that could be measured in warmth and patience rather than noise and applause. By late morning, curiosity had turned into a small procession. Benny Thompson showed up first, shuffling through the snow toward the porch. He kicked at a stray stone, watching it wobble but hold its place. "I can't believe it," he muttered. "It's keeping the air in." Luke wiped his hands on a rag, feeling the grit of stone and splinters embedded in his skin. "It's physics," he said, "and stubbornness can't hurt to have both." Word traveled fast. By noon, 2 more neighbors had come by, hats pulled low, noses red, eyes wide with incredulity. They circled the walls like anthropologists examining a newly discovered monument, murmuring about angles and stones, angles and stones. Luke explained what he could, demonstrating how to wedge each rock, how to balance the logs so the walls absorbed the wind instead of surrendering to it. Then the trouble began. It started subtly at first. A cold draft crept along the edge of the porch, slipping under the logs, twisting into corners Luke hadn't accounted for. He felt the chill crawl over his ankles, a reminder that winter was relentless. By mid-afternoon, the neighbors had gone, leaving Luke alone with the whispering wind and the growing unease that maybe he hadn't thought of everything. He inspected the walls carefully. Some stones had shifted overnight, small gaps forming where pressure had been uneven. A log on the far side leaned just slightly, like it might topple with enough provocation. Luke knelt, testing each segment with a hand and a practiced eye. One misaligned stone could undo hours of work, but he adjusted it, pressed it back into place, listening to the wind's response. It was a conversation, a negotiation, and the air shifted subtly, almost respectfully. By late afternoon, a new concern emerged: the heat. The walls trapped warmth effectively, yes, but they also changed airflow in ways Luke hadn't anticipated. The stove, usually a mild companion, now radiated more aggressively, warming the air in ways that made some corners of the kitchen stifling. The small dining area felt like a sauna, while the hallway toward the bedrooms retained a stubborn chill. He adjusted the stones, widening small gaps to encourage subtle circulation, learning that holding heat was only half the battle. The other half was knowing where it should go. That evening, the first real test came, a gust unlike any he had faced so far. It roared across the plains, lifting dry grass and rattling every loose board on his house. The kind of wind that had made him shiver in his father's barn decades ago, the one that seemed to bend the world around it. Luke braced at the doorframe, watching the logs flex under the pressure. Snow whirled like tiny missiles, slapping against the rough-hewn wood, and for a moment he feared failure. One loose stone would compromise the entire wall, and all the warmth he'd earned would be gone. He gritted his teeth and pressed a gloved hand against the nearest log, feeling the slight give under his fingers. It shifted, but only a little. He adjusted another stone, wedged a smaller log tighter into place, and the wind, as if realizing it had met resistance it couldn't break, swirled around, slapping at the sides and retreating slightly from the gap. By nightfall, Luke could see the effect inside the house. The kitchen, dining area, and even the narrow hallway were uniformly warm. The stove's heat no longer battled against drafts but flowed gently through the space, coiling in corners, filling every crevice. Luke exhaled a long, satisfied breath. But satisfaction came with complications. Word of his success had spread, and now the neighbors were watching more closely. Some offered help, others whispered skepticism. "What if it falls? That thing's going to rot before February. You're playing with fire, Luke, or frostbite." Luke ignored them. He had learned that any victory worth having required patience and courage. Still, the pressure weighed on him, not from the wind, not even from the work itself, but from the eyes watching every move, waiting for failure. Late that night, he sat by the stove, pen and notebook in hand. He sketched diagrams of the walls, notes about angles, stone placement, and airflow. Every gust tested the structure, and he recorded it meticulously. This wasn't just survival, it was study, preparation, proof. He needed to understand why it worked, and more importantly, how to replicate it before the worst of winter descended. Sleep finally came in the small hours, brief and unsteady, punctuated by the howl of the wind against logs and stones. Luke dreamed of walls bending and cracking, of houses surrendering to cold, of families shivering inside homes that could have been warm. He woke with a start, heart pounding, checked the walls. They were intact, holding, breathing. The morning revealed the true extent of his work. Frost had settled against the logs like white fur, a delicate coat shielding the walls from ice. Sunlight hit the stones, revealing tiny cracks, imperfections, and subtle angles he had missed. There were lessons to be learned, adjustments to be made. He spent hours reinforcing weak spots, swapping logs, adding small stones to stabilize gaps, all while the wind teased him with gusts and whispers. Every move was careful, precise, deliberate. Failure wasn't an option, not just for him, but for anyone who might depend on these walls to survive the season. By mid-afternoon, he noticed movement across the road. Benny and a few others were bringing logs, stones, tools. Some were hesitant, unsure, but all had that spark of curiosity or maybe hope. Luke didn't lead them at first. He simply demonstrated, showing how to wedge a stone properly, how to balance weight, how to anticipate the wind's insistence. The first attempts were clumsy. Stones fell. Logs wobbled. Voices raised in frustration. But slowly, methodically, the neighbors began to understand. Their hands were raw, fingers blistered, faces red from exertion and cold, but walls began to rise along the property line, creating a network of protection that Luke hadn't anticipated. That night, the wind returned with renewed vigor. It swept across the plains, rattling the skeletal trees and biting at faces unprotected by walls. Yet when Luke stepped inside, the house was warm. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but undeniably warmer than it had been for decades. Heat had weight now, substance. It lingered, pooled, flowed. It existed because someone had defied the wind, spoken to it in timber and stone. And somewhere deep down, Luke realized this was only the beginning. Winters like this weren't forgiving. The storms would come bigger and stronger, and the walls would be tested, stretched, pushed. But he now understood something essential. Ingenuity, persistence, and the courage to endure mockery could bend even the harshest elements. As he climbed into bed that night, muscles aching, face grimy, he allowed himself a small, private smile. Tomorrow would bring challenges. There would be setbacks, debates, moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, Luke Carter felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope that the cold could be held at bay, at least for a while. Outside, the wind whispered against logs and stones, a low, relentless voice. But Luke knew now it could be negotiated with, tamed, challenged, and sometimes, just sometimes, it could be made to yield. The storm came without warning, though Luke had learned long ago that winter in Nebraska rarely asked permission. By mid-morning, the sky had darkened to a steel gray, clouds hanging low over the plains like a weight pressing the earth flat. The wind had risen to a steady roar, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and frozen soil. Luke felt it through the walls of his house, a faint vibration beneath the floorboards, a reminder that nature would not be ignored. He stood at the front door, peering through the small window in the frame. His log-and-stone walls held firm, snow piling against their outer face like obedient soldiers, but the gusts didn't relent. Across the road, the neighbors' walls wavered under the pressure, panels shifting, stones rattling, some succumbing entirely. A sharp pang of responsibility hit him. This wasn't just about his comfort anymore. Every miscalculation could mean cold, hardship, maybe even danger for someone else. "Damn it," Luke muttered under his breath, grabbing his coat, hat, and gloves. He opened the door to a gale that slammed into him, nearly ripping his breath away. Snow lashed his face, sharp enough to sting through the layers of fabric. He leaned into the wind, boots biting into the crusted snow, moving toward Tom Renshaw's house first. Tom's front yard was a chaos of flailing boards and scattered stones. His wall had tilted dangerously, a gap at the base sucking cold air straight into the house. Through the flying snow, Luke could see Tom struggling with his son in tow, trying to keep him warm. "Luke, thank God," Tom shouted, teeth chattering. "It's getting worse, I can't, my boy's shivering." Luke didn't hesitate. He waded into the mess, hands gripping timber and rope, hauling logs back into place. The wind fought him every step, driving snow under his coat and into his gloves. Fingers numb, muscles screaming, he pressed a stone into a shifting gap, wedged a brace against the leaning log. The wind responded, hissing, clawing, testing his adjustments. Inside, Tom's son was wrapped in blankets, wide-eyed and trembling. His mother tried to keep the small furnace from straining under the cold, but the airflow from the misaligned wall was relentless. Luke crouched beside the boy, checking his jacket, his gloves, the way he huddled into his mother's chest. "You're okay," he said firmly. "We'll fix this." Hours passed in a blur of motion. Luke and Tom reinforced the walls, replacing fallen stones, adding extra logs to fortify weak points, bracing against gusts that seemed to come from very direction at once. Every time Luke thought a section was stable, a new flurry threatened to undo it. He yelled instructions over the roar of the wind, sweat mixing with snow melt on his face, and for a moment the bitter reality hit him. This was more than a simple experiment. It was a battle with the elements, and people's lives depended on it. At Martha Keene's house, the situation was even more desperate. Her wall had collapsed partially, the stones scattered across the front steps, and the wind funneled straight into her living room. She tried to lift a brace herself, but the gust nearly knocked her backward. Luke arrived just in time, grabbing the brace, holding it while she wedged a stone into place. "We'll get it," he shouted over the wind. "Just hold steady." The hours dragged on, the storm showing no mercy. Luke's back ached from lifting and twisting logs, his gloves torn and wet, fingers stiff with cold. Snow blew in at angles that made each move a gamble. At one point, a panel ripped free from the top of the wall near Tom's house, slamming into the porch railing. Luke lunged, catching it with his shoulder and wrenching it back into position, the sound of splintering wood ringing in his ears. Through it all, the neighbors had begun to rally. Some brought extra stones, some thick rope, others simply offered moral support. The tension in the air was electric, each success met with a relieved nod, each failure with grim determination. No one laughed, no one mocked. The mockery of weeks past had been replaced with urgency, respect, and fear. As night approached, the storm reached its peak. Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind carried ice pellets that cut through layers of clothing, and the snow began to drift in waves across the plains, swallowing fences, cars, and yard markers. Luke paused on Tom's porch, breathing heavily, heart racing. He could barely see the tops of the walls he'd worked so hard to stabilize, yet he could feel them, solid, stubborn, resilient. Suddenly, a cry pierced the chaos. Luke spun toward Martha's house. A corner of her wall had collapsed entirely, the stones spilling into the yard. She was trying to shield herself and her youngest grandchild from the wind, but the gale shoved her backward. Luke didn't think. He sprinted across the snow, boots sinking deep, body leaning into the blast. He grabbed her just as another gust threatened to knock her down, steadying both her and the child. "We're going to fix it," he yelled, breath freezing in the air. "Hold on." Together, they rebuilt the corner, Luke stacking stones while Martha held the brace steady, the child clinging to her mother. The wind screamed in retaliation, hurling ice and snow like missiles. But slowly, painstakingly, the wall rose again, sturdier than before. By midnight, Luke was exhausted to the point of collapse. His face was raw, his hands blistered, his legs trembling. But the walls stood. The heat from stoves and furnaces, once squandered, now pooled behind reinforced barriers, moving through the houses in gentle, controlled waves. Families huddled inside, finally protected from the storm's fury. Tom leaned against his rebuilt wall, chest heaving, eyes wet. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "I thought we'd freeze for sure. His voice broke. "You saved us." Luke shook his head, too tired to speak. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and relief in equal measure. Martha approached, eyes wide, voice low. "Luke, I don't know how to thank you. My house, my family, we would have been frozen solid." "You did the work too," Luke said quietly. "We all did. Just followed the wind, listened to it, worked with it instead of against it." Outside, the storm continued its rage, but the walls held. The wind tested them endlessly, shifted, changed direction, sought weaknesses. But Luke and the neighbors had learned its patterns. Every stone, every log, every brace mattered. And now, for the first time, the wind was negotiating with them, not ruling them. Luke finally returned home in the early hours, soaked, exhausted, but alive with the grim satisfaction of a battle fought and partially won. He stripped off layers, washed the grit and blood from his hands, and sat by the stove, letting its gentle heat seep into his frozen limbs. He stared at the log walls outside, the stones catching faint moonlight, and felt a deep, resonant pride. This night had been more than a test of ingenuity. It had been a test of courage, endurance, and community. The neighbors had seen what could be done, felt the truth in it, and participated in the defense of their own homes. The laughter from weeks ago was gone. Respect, gratitude, and cautious awe had taken its place. And yet Luke knew the battle wasn't over. Winter had only begun. Storms would come colder and fiercer than tonight. Each gust could bring lessons, failures, or danger. But he had learned something vital. Heat could be held, wind be tamed, and walls, no matter how humble, could protect more than just bodies. They could protect hope. He leaned back, exhausted, letting his mind wander over the events of the past hours. The ache in his muscles was a reminder of effort, the frostbite in his fingertips a reminder of nature's relentless will. But the warmth creeping through the house, through the walls, through the stones, it was proof. Proof that persistence, ingenuity, and courage could outlast even the cruelest storm. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, Luke knew one thing with certainty. Tomorrow would demand vigilance, care, and adaptation. But for the first time in a long time, he also knew that he could face it. And whatever winter threw next, he would be ready, not alone, not unprepared, and not untested. The morning after the storm arrived soft and unreal. Sunlight sifted weakly through the clouded sky, a pale wash over snow-laden fields. The wind had relented to a whisper, a tentative truce, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Luke stepped outside, boots crunching into the frost-hardened drifts, and surveyed the damage. The plains stretched endlessly, flat and white, dotted here and there with the remnants of walls, some intact, some shattered, some leaning at odd angles. His own log-and-stone walls stood firm, the stones still snug between the logs, the gaps carefully closed, the structure solid and unyielding. The furnace inside hummed quietly, warm air spilling from vents in steady, comforting waves. He breathed deeply, the sharp, clean winter air filling his lungs, and felt something that had been absent for weeks: relief. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, blinking against the pale light, inspecting the results of their collective efforts. There was laughter, soft, cautious, weary laughter, but it carried a note of pride now. Heads nodded, smiles exchanged, and for the first time in months, mockery had no place. The walls had done their work, and the evidence was indisputable. Tom Renshaw was the first to cross the road. His boots left deep impressions in the snow, his face wind-burned and tired. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice rough but steady, eyes fixed on Luke. "If it weren't for you, my boy, we'd have frozen for sure." Luke shrugged, brushing snow off his coat. "You did the work too," he said. "We all did, just followed the wind, worked with it instead of against it." Tom shook his head, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. "You've got patience I don't think I'll ever match, and brains to see what none of us could. God, Luke, you saved us." Martha Keene came next, leading her grandchildren, bundled in blankets. She wrapped Luke in a brief, tight hug. "You saved my house," she whispered. "My family, you saved us." Luke smiled faintly, letting the warmth of gratitude wash over him. It was the kind of warmth that stayed longer than the heat from any stove. Other neighbors joined, curious now, cautious, hesitant at first, then emboldened by the sight of success. They shared stories of their own walls, tales of near disaster, minor collapses, frantic repairs during the storm's peak. Luke listened, nodded, offered small advice, never boasting, never claiming the victory as solely his own. The walls themselves told the story. Bent panels, broken braces, some stones scattered across the snow. But where they remained upright, the structures had held. The heat, once lost to the unyielding winter, was now captured, redirected, held in place like liquid gold behind the logs and stones. Families peeked through frosted windows, realizing that simple, unpretentious ingenuity could outsmart the harshest forces. By midday, word had spread beyond the immediate street. People came from nearby valleys, other townships, curious and skeptical, armed with cameras, notebooks, even a buzzing drone overhead. Luke found himself explaining angles, airflow, spacing, the subtle, almost imperceptible math of survival. He spoke slowly, deliberately, careful with every word. What had been a private effort, a small experiment born from necessity, had grown into a movement, a lesson the plains themselves would remember. Even the county sent another inspector, Susan Mayer. She arrived mid-afternoon, clipboard in hand, her boots crunching softly in the snow. She circled Luke's wall, tapped a brace, and nodded approval in her eyes. "Looks solid," she said. "You might want to document this. Could save a lot of people next winter." Luke shrugged, faintly smiling. "Didn't think of that." "You should," she replied. "You've got something that works." The skeptics, those who had whispered, who had worried about property values, who had joked at his expense, were now silent. The cold had come. It had struck hard. And Luke's walls, imperfect, unassuming homemade, had held it at bay. Proof, irrefutable, that effort, ingenuity, and stubborn determination could conquer even the cruelest elements. As evening approached, Key stood on his porch looking out over the snow-blanketed road. The wind had calmed to a whisper, teasing only at the edges of remaining drifts. The walls leaned quietly, faithful sentinels, silent guardians of warmth and safety. Families moved about inside their homes, lights glowing behind frost-covered windows, a soft hum of conversation and laughter filling the rooms. Martha's family stopped by with a loaf of bread and a thermos of soup. Tom came over talking quietly about reinforcing walls before the next deep freeze hit. Neighbors lingered, sharing tips, pointing out minor adjustments, cheering for successes, laughing at minor failures. Luke realized quietly that he hadn't just built walls. He had built something far more enduring: connection, trust, the knowledge that even in isolation, people could band together to protect what mattered. Later, when the visitors had left and the snow had settled, Luke went inside alone. He sat by the stove, letting its gentle warmth seep into his chilled limbs, reflecting on the events of the past days. The wind still whispered outside, testing the limits of every wall, every seam, every stone, but it no longer entered unchallenged. Not here, not tonight, not as long as he and his neighbors stood vigilant. For the first time in years, Luke allowed himself to imagine the future without dread. Winter would come again, storms would rage, cold would try to claim their homes. But now he knew something vital. Ingenuity, courage, and community could bend even the harshest elements to human will. And sometimes that was enough. He stood, brushing the snow from his pants, and looked out the window one last time. Shadows stretched across the snow, long and thin, but inside warmth lingered. Lights burned bright, families huddled together, safe and steady. The wind still prowled the plains, relentless and persistent, but it no longer ruled. Not tonight, not here. Luke smiled quietly, letting the moment settle over him like a soft, comforting blanket. The cold had been held at bay, yes, but more importantly, people had been reminded how to fight together, how to protect, how to survive. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Walls could shield more than bodies, they could hold hope. He closed the window, stepped back, and let the quiet envelop him. The storm had passed. The draft was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Luke Harlan felt truly at home. The story ends with a cinematic sense of closure. The storm defeated, the walls standing, the community bonded, and Luke's personal journey of resilience and leadership complete.